So we have people joining us, folks, and we'll just take a moment for the people to come through the gateway, and we'll take the ship out. And I hope everyone has their coffee, and we're good to go. I could ask everyone just to take the time to mute themselves if they haven't already done so. And we'll keep an overwatch of that. Okay, Jim, good to have you here this morning, and it's always good to catch up. It's been an interesting period. We're actually almost at that segue point. It was this time last year that we were heading into the tunnel, getting ready to come out into the first of the sequence of events, the first lockdown period. If you recall, the St. Patrick's Day parade was cancelled, and we're looking at a mirror event occurring this year, unfortunately. So I guess to everyone that's joining, hello, my name is Patrick Downs, and I'm your host here this morning. This masterclass is one in a series being produced by the Institute of Management Consultants and Advisors, which is the internationally accredited body representing the consulting profession here in Ireland. And look, we'll be sending you a link with our details after the event and recording this event. So in the meantime, if you want to take a look at us, we're on the web and Twitter and LinkedIn and so forth and so on. Equally, I know it's not me you're here to see, and a few housekeeping items before we take the ship out. I'd note that our president and some of our board members are with us here, and we'd send a big shout out to them. Thank you, John, for joining. And equally to our UK and Canadian colleagues who are joining us, thank you for getting up and joining us. It's always appreciated, and we look forward to any questions you may have. As you will have noted before you came in, this is for GDPR compliance. We just note you that it is being recorded. If you have any issues, please step off deck now. If not, we'll be sending out the recording to you afterwards. And feel free to ask Jim any questions in the chat box during the course of the event. I know some of you have sent in some questions, and I thank you for that. And Jim has kindly said he will try and bat them back if at all possible. He has the hurley there in the schlitter, and he's ready to rock and roll after the event. So he's in fine fettle. He's had his porridge and his Weetabix, and he's raring to go. So that said, look, we're delighted to have you, Jim. Thank you for taking the time. Really appreciate it. You know, it's always good to hear your insight into things, and you know, you need very little introduction from our perspective in this audience. One of Ireland's leading and best known economic analysts and commentators, and you know, I guess it's fair to say you have a wealth of experience in delivering insight, economic analysis and forecasts and commentary to both the Irish and international audience. We see you regularly in the papers and on podcasts, over the web, TV debates and so forth and so on. And in the culinary tradition of all men from the south, the southeast, the Sunshine State, I see you've joined Love Irish Food there recently to keep the fiddles going. So well done on that. And we might have a chat about your whole point, your kind of whole view on governance on another day, but that's for another session. So Jim and myself have soldiered in the trenches. We go back a long way together. We've shed blood in the mud, so to speak, economically speaking. And the name of the session here this morning is "It was the worst of times, it was the best of times," because it has that sort of Dickens sense of it. And Jim, it's a bitterly cold Thursday morning, and we're heading into, gosh, almost a mirror event. St. Patrick's Day is cancelled, postponed, locked down. We're not going to be marching anytime soon, or indeed wetting the shamrock. Easter similarly is looking a bit bleak, to be honest. And to use a term from your own discipline, a black swan event, it would seem, you know, that we are literally swimming in a pond of black swans at the moment, with, you know, Brexit on one side, the turmoil across the geopolitical landscape, that we've seen huge pan-European change, continental United States change, South American change in terms of the political landscape, not to mention China. So there's huge turmoil in the political space. And, you know, we haven't even hit the Ides of March yet. So, Jim, really interested to get your steer on the as is and the road ahead. And Akara, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, Pat. Thank you very much for the invitation and indeed the introduction. I suppose what I want to talk about today really is the economic environment, both internationally and domestically, and to try and see how that impacts on us here, and looking ahead, you know, what some influential factors will be in driving the business environment and so on. I guess the place to start is looking at, what's happened on the international front, because as you know, we are, as a country, the textbook example of a small open economy. External trade, foreign direct investment are really important parts of our whole economic model and have been for the last 50 years progressively. So international events have a huge impact here, and it's really important, I think, to understand how those international events impact on us in this country. Looking back at this time last year, well, a little bit earlier actually, at the beginning of 2020, we had just come through a relatively difficult year for the world economy. We saw a significant slowdown in economic activity, particularly in the euro area. And kind of surprisingly enough, it had very little impact on us here because the momentum in the Irish economy in 2019 was very, very good. And external events didn't really impact that significantly. But coming into 2020, I certainly had a more optimistic outlook on the global economy for a couple of reasons. One, I believe that a hard Brexit would be avoided at the end of January last year, which it was. I also believe that ahead of the presidential election in November in the United States, that Trump would start to back up his trade war with China, because there's no doubt about it, that trade dispute during 2019 had a huge impact on global economic activity, business confidence, and so on, because let's face it, globalization has been the global model for the last 50 years, and suddenly it was starting to come into serious question because of the activities of Trump. But anyway, I believe that in the run-up to the presidential election, the last thing Trump would want would be a serious global trade dispute, particularly between the States and China, and because it would obviously do significant damage to the US economy. And by the end of February, I was feeling a little bit cocky. We avoided a hard Brexit. We saw a gradual reduction in tariffs between the States and China. So we were being set up for a decent year. And then, of course, in early March, the global pandemic was declared and everything fundamentally changed at that point. We've seen a sharp slowdown in global economic activity. And normal economic recessions are caused when you get a shock. When oil prices went up a couple of times in the 70s, 73 and again 79. We saw the bursting of the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s. We saw the great financial crash emanating from the United States back in 2008, which reverberated around the world economy and hit us here in Ireland particularly hard. But those are typically the things that cause recessions, whereas this time round, it was a pandemic, and effectively we saw large segments of economies being shut down, which is pretty unprecedented. And for the last 12 months, we have to varying degrees around the world been living with varying levels of rolling lockdowns and so on. But sharp slowdown in economic activity, that goes without saying. I think what's also really important is that, unlike back in 2008, this time there has been a very strong, coordinated, aggressive response from policymakers. One of the first things the EU Commission did this time last year, a little bit later, by the end of March at least, was to relax the fiscal rules, to relax state aid rules, and so on. And also, countries in the European Union were basically encouraged to go out there and spend as much money as you need to spend to keep your households, to keep your businesses alive. Because, as I say, this was a very different shock, in a sense that perfectly functioning businesses were just forced to shut down. So in recognition of that, there was clearly a requirement to provide as much financial and fiscal support as possible to make sure that once we came out the other end of the pandemic, that as many businesses as possible would still be there to pick up the baton and drive economic recovery. And likewise, to make sure that household finances were maintained in as healthy a state as possible. So very strong fiscal response. We also got a very strong monetary policy response from central banks. We saw interest rates being cut virtually everywhere, although there wasn't much scope for cutting rates because they were already at historically low levels or close to coming into that crisis. But where possible, interest rates were cut. But more importantly, central banks stepped in. They engaged in massive quantitative easing. They bought bonds. They forced bond yields down. And what we really saw happening, and it continues, is that fiscal and monetary policy have been operating in total coordination. Governments, on the one hand, are being encouraged to spend and to borrow. And on the other hand, central banks have ensured that bond yields or debt interest costs would remain as low as possible to facilitate that borrowing. So that's really, really important part of the response. As I said, the nature of the last 12 months and indeed the nature of the global recovery will be very subject to the path of the virus, rolling lockdowns, and so on. And as I say, we've seen over the months, to varying degrees, different countries, the sort of lockdowns that have occurred. There's a lot of obvious blame game going on out there about, governments messing it up, so on and so forth. But I think it's a little bit, it's too early to judge what countries did well and what countries didn't do well, because it's quite amazing in the space of a couple of weeks, countries can flip from being the heroes to being the villains. It's been quite extraordinary. And I mean, in early December, Ireland was top of the EU league in terms of getting the thing under control. And then, of course, by the by the beginning of January, we were top of the league, but for very different reasons. So, and likewise, the whole Swedish response and, and so on. So too early to judge, because let's face it, for policymakers, this is a crisis without precedent. There's no template to tell you what, a rule book to tell you what you should be doing. So policymakers have really been sort of doing things, adjusting as they go along to circumstances. So it's been incredibly difficult. I suppose the biggest positive in the last number of months has been the extent to which the global pharma industry actually managed to deliver and is delivering a significant number of vaccines, with a lot more in the pipeline. And so that's very, very positive. Countries to varying degrees are now struggling, some doing quite well, others struggling to roll out the vaccine program. I kind of suspect that there's an element here again of a sort of learning as you go along, because this is pretty much an unprecedented challenge for policymakers in rolling out the vaccine program. But clearly, it'd be naive to suggest anything other than the global economy, and indeed the Irish economy, for the next 12 months will be heavily determined and driven by the successful rollout of the vaccine program. Okay, so what I'm really saying is, speaking to an economist this morning is a waste of time. This is all about epidemiology rather than economic fundamentals. So the path of the virus, the effective delivery of the vaccine program is really important. I have picked a few sort of global issues that I think are important. Looking at the Biden presidency, he's whatever, a month and a half into the presidency at this stage. We have seen a massive fiscal policy response from the United States. I mean, and this is typical of how the US responds to crises. Back in March, there was a $2 trillion fiscal package introduced, including sending households checks in the post. That was the largest ever fiscal stimulus package in the United States, or indeed globally. And then one of the last things Trump did before he left office was to agree to another $900 billion package. And at the moment, Biden is trying to push through the Senate a 1.9 trillion fiscal package. So if the 1.9 trillion fiscal package is delivered, which I think it will be, basically what we've seen in 12 months is a fiscal stimulus equivalent to 25% of US GDP. I mean, it's amazing. It's enormous. It's incredible. And there is quite a bit of disagreement in the States at the moment. And the economics community, as usual, is split down the middle on this 1.9 trillion fiscal stimulus package because, you know, some argue the economy actually doesn't need it. Others argue that it will just create a serious inflation problem, and that the package needs to be significantly lower. I kind of get the impression Biden is very much adopting a sort of belt and braces approach to this. He's not taking any risks with the economic recovery. He's going to throw as much money as possible at it. I also think there is a very strong political motivation behind what he's doing, because one of the big global issues, well, as I see it, there are two really, really big global issues that will dominate for years to come. One is climate change. The other is the growth inequality, the growth of global inequality, particularly in the United States, and that is definitely feeding into populist politics. The Brexit vote in the UK, the emergence of Trump as a serious political force. I think inequality, and of course the rise of extreme politics in many other countries, I think there's a very strong economic stroke social driving force behind all of that. So Biden recognizes, actually, you know, if he's to keep populist politics under control, if he's to prevent the re-emergence of Trump or a Trump-like person, that it is essential to address those inequality problems. And I saw a statistic in the last 24 hours. It's estimated that if Biden delivers this, as a Freudian slip, if Biden delivers this fiscal package, it will actually cut by 50% household poverty in the United States. So I think there's a very strong political motivation behind what he's doing, and obviously using the economic story. He has pledged, whether, and he said very little about this, to my knowledge, since elected, because the fiscal stimulus package has sort of dominated most of what he's done since coming into office. But part of his election manifesto was to increase the corporation tax rate from 21 to 28%, you know, reverse a lot of that cut that Trump delivered earlier in his presidency. From an Irish perspective, that would represent good news, because it would certainly make Ireland a relatively attractive location for US foreign direct investment. So that's one thing. But I think more importantly, and I think this is the, as an internationalist, I suppose I would say this, but I think one of the things that really depressed me about Trump was the manner in which he picked battles and rows with everybody. Okay, there's strong justification for taking on China on a number of different areas. But when you see Trump starting to pick battles with the European Union, for example, I just think that in the face of the challenges posed by the emergence of two global superpowers, as in China and to a lesser extent India, there was never a time when the West needed to be more united, and yet Trump was pushing it in a different direction. So Biden, he cut his teeth in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He understands internationalism, he understands multilateral institutions, and so on. So he's taking a much more multilateral approach to global affairs. He's taken the US back into the World Health Organization. He's taken the United States back into the Paris Climate Accord. So that's all very positive engagement, I believe, with the world. He will, I believe, work to improve the damaged relationship with the European Union. I believe that his approach to China will be aggressive, and I don't think he's going to change too much from what Trump was doing. And one of the reasons for that is because there is a lot of popular and political support in the United States for taking on China. But bottom line is, I do believe that Trump's exit, I think at an emotional level and at an economic level, it's and a political level, it's good news. But clearly, the political challenges in the States are very immense going forward, because it's a very, very divided country when you see Trump getting over 70 million votes and so on in the presidential election. It just shows you the nature of the challenge. And I think anybody that observes the, excuse me, the partisan approach to politics in the United States, it's pretty fractured. There's a lot of work to do. But I do think from an Irish and a global perspective, Biden does actually promise better things for all of us. Yesterday, the Chancellor of the Exchequer delivered the UK budget. Okay, first budget really outside of the European Union. And the budget is, and I think this is important for Ireland as well, the budget is characterised by providing massive short-term support via fiscal policy to the UK economy to get it out of the COVID situation. And then there is a longer-term objective to engage in fiscal consolidation. In other words, to try and they're going to build up a significant deficit over the next year or two. And then the plan is that they start to draw in that deficit again. Yesterday, he pledged an extra 65 billion in public spending. That would bring the total public spending response to about 470 billion pounds sterling. Some of the things he did, and I suppose why I put up this stuff to this level of detail, it kind of shows you the UK government's approach to helping business. He's extended the furlough scheme to the end of September. And under that scheme, government will pay 80% of salary. And then employers will make a 10% contribution from July, and then 20% contribution from August. So a gradual easing down of the furlough scheme, but nevertheless, it has been extended significantly. He has created a recovery loan scheme, which is 80% guaranteed by government. He increased significantly from £1,500 to £3,000 the incentive scheme for taking on new apprentices. And he's also invested a lot of money in training programs and so on. He has given, or at least extended, the business rates holiday for retail, hospitality and leisure to the end of June. And then it'll be at 2/3 holiday for a further 9 months till the end of the next financial year. 5% VAT rate for hospitality and tourism up to the end of September. And then it'll go up to 12.5% until April, and then will revert to 20%. I think significantly, he has pledged that from 2023, he will increase the corporation tax rate from 19% up to 25%. And for companies earning under 50,000, it will remain at 19%. So the point is, there was a sort of a fear over the last couple of years in the context of Brexit and Brexit-related uncertainty that Britain would seek to become Singapore upon Thames. In other words, the UK government would pursue a very aggressive corporation tax approach to try and attract foreign direct investment into the United Kingdom. And obviously that will pose a massive challenge for Ireland. So it is interesting that, he's moving in the other direction. So that's positive for Ireland. But I do think a negative for Ireland is the fact that with the US and UK corporation tax rates set to go up, this will focus international attention very much on our 12.5% corporation tax rate. So I think there are positives and potential negatives from the corporation tax changes that Rishi Sunak made yesterday. The other thing he did was from 2022 to 2026, he has frozen the various income tax credits. So in other words, I just repeat the point, the strong approach in the budget in the short term provide a lot of support to businesses and to households. And then sort of from 22, 23 onwards, we start to see a gradual ratcheting up of fiscal policy to try and break the public finances back into shape. But in overall terms, certainly a good budget yesterday for the UK economy. I think other issues at a global level that are really important, I've mentioned the growth of political populism, and no country really has been spared these sorts of pressures. We have it here in our own country. We had Brexit, we had Trump, and so on. So political populism is a really, really big challenge. As I said, I believe that one of the ways we've got to react to that growth of political populism is through addressing one of the root causes, which is global inequality. Of course, there may be people listening to this, or there may be people out there who regard political populism as a really positive thing. Personally, I don't. Second big issue is climate change. It's very reassuring, in my view, that Biden has taken the United States back into the Paris Climate Accord. We have the COP26 meetings happening in Glasgow in November of this year. So the whole climate change agenda is thankfully being given the sort of importance again that it needs. And there's no doubt about it, from an economic policy perspective, from a business perspective, environmental credentials, addressing the climate change agenda really is going to be a key driver of macro strategy, but also at the business level, business strategy. Brexit, another issue. We obviously avoided the hard Brexit on the 31st of December, just gone, when Britain left the transition mechanism. And thankfully, we avoided the hard Brexit and the application of World Trade Organization trading arrangements. That was good, but there is no doubt about it. It is creating a lot of difficulties. Perhaps some of those difficulties are just teething troubles, and that they will eventually be ironed out. But what's happening with Northern Ireland is worrying. And also, however these teething problems are sorted, there's no doubt about it, Brexit does fundamentally change the way in which the Irish economy and Irish businesses do business with the United Kingdom. It does mark a deterioration in that trading relationship. And I think we've got to accept that, and it'd be naive to believe otherwise. The opportunity, of course, is, in my view, on the import substitution part. Pat mentioned in his introduction that I had come on board with Love Irish Food. Actually, I was chairman of Love Irish Food for 10 years from 2009 up until the beginning of this year. And I stepped away from the chairmanship and just became an ordinary board member. But the food sector is obviously one sector that has significantly been impacted by Brexit. And it could have been impacted much more disastrously, particularly the beef industry, for example. But the opportunity is that supply chains are under pressure. We are finding it increasingly difficult, and retailers are in sourcing some consumer food products. So I do think the opportunity here that the Irish agri-food sector has grasped is the potential for import substitution. So in other words, some of the stuff we already import from the United Kingdom, can we look at manufacturing it here ourselves? I think another big issue is that the threat of inflation and the policy response to that. mean, for the last 10 years, certainly in this part of the world, for 30 years in Japan, the battle on the inflation front has been against deflation, falling prices rather than rapidly rising prices. There is a view now that that may be about to change because we have seen commodity prices increase dramatically in the last 12 months, having collapsed just after COVID hit. So that will obviously lead to a year-on-year significant increase in fuel prices and energy, and we're seeing that at the fuel pumps at the moment. But I think more fundamentally, the fear would be that there's now so much fiscal and monetary policy stimulus in the system. And on top of that, one thing we did see everywhere, particularly here in this country, but everywhere, it's a phenomenon. In the last 12 months, household savings have increased dramatically, and corporate savings have also increased very significantly. And the reason for that is consumers can spend in many cases. Businesses are reluctant to invest given how much uncertainty there is at the moment. But as soon as, excuse me, confidence returns, and the vaccine, I think, is what will drive this, is the trigger, you could see a lot of corporate and personal spending power come back into the system, leading to some pickup in inflation. Personally, I would welcome a pickup in inflation. We do need some inflation in the system. It's good. Obviously, the challenge is to control it. And one of the problems is that if there is an upsurge in inflation, how do policymakers respond? Do they start rowing back on quantitative easing? Do they start increasing official interest rates? Well, if they do, they then create a serious fiscal problem, because those countries who have run up significant budget deficits, which we all have in the last year and will again this year, one of the things that has given us the ability to do that is the fact that long-term interest rates are at such low levels. So if rates start to rise, debt servicing becomes a big challenge for many countries. Okay, so I think how policymakers respond to inflation is really, really going to be a very, very difficult balancing act. My view would be that policymakers should tolerate a bit of inflation in the system. They should go with it for the moment, and increasing taxes or increasing interest rates prematurely could be very, very damaging to the economic recovery. And then the other issue is the global corporation tax agenda, which I've sort of mentioned, but there's a lot of stuff going on. There's the common consolidated corporate tax base stuff that's working through the European Union. We have the new transparency laws that the EU is trying to push through the system. We have the base erosion profit shifting, the BEPS project that's been run by the OECD. And as I said, with UK and US corporation tax rates set to rise, that'll focus more attention on Ireland's corporate tax system. So there's a lot of pressure coming on our corporate tax model that we need to think about, and we need to deal with that as it happens. Looking at the international context, statistically, Ireland did very well in 2020 on a GDP basis. And in fact, Ireland will have been one of only 2 countries that delivered positive economic growth in 2020. However, Patrick Honohan, the former governor of the central bank, wrote an economic letter for the central bank recently, highlighting the issues here. GDP in an Irish context is grossly exaggerates the real health of the economy, because you have aircraft leasing activities, you have intellectual property rights being intellectual property assets being moved into the country since 2015. So there's a lot of distortion in GDP. And if you look at a modified version of GDP, which is called gross national income STAR, it strips out all of this sort of nebulous stuff, and it gives us a real picture of what's happening in the economy. And last year, while GDP is likely to have increased by 3%, modified growth is likely to have contracted by about 6 to 7%. That's a more realistic assessment. However, one thing that has become really clear in Ireland over the last 12 months is the dual nature of the economy and the workforce. Foreign direct investment, public sector, financial services, professional services have continued to do well through the pandemic. On the other hand, if you're involved in tourism, hospitality, non-essential retail, personal services, the airline industry, it's been a dreadful 12 months. And so it's very much a dual economy. There has been, as I've mentioned, a very strong fiscal response from our government, ongoing financial supports for businesses and for households, but those supports will have to be improved upon, because we're stuck in level 5 at the moment, and there is no clear path out of level 5 for the foreseeable future. And clearly that will be driven by the rollout of the vaccine. And I think you would have to be concerned about the manner in which the European Union, and by implication Ireland, has dealt with the vaccine rollout to date. The other, I suppose, dominant issues coming out of COVID, health and the health system, and more important, well, sorry, I shouldn't say more importantly, but this definitely predates COVID-19, and that was the crisis in the housing market. And obviously, with the construction sector, or a large part of it, stuck in level 5 lockdown, we're just not going to see the delivery of housing supply that is required. But definitely, housing is a big, big economic, social, and political challenge that will dominate the landscape for the foreseeable future. This is, I think, interesting. It's a breakdown of tax revenues in 2020. Overall tax take was down by just 3.6%, which is pretty minuscule in the context of what happened to the economy last year. And within that, the VAT take was down by almost 18%. No surprise there, because consumer spending, car sales, etc., fell heavily. A couple of things that stand out though. The income tax take was down by just 1%, despite the fact that for much of last year, we had over 500,000 people on the pandemic unemployment payment. So what that tells us is that the progressive nature of our tax system, those people who pay the bulk of income tax, because of the progressive nature of our tax system, are relatively high earners in the sectors that I mentioned that have been largely immune to COVID-19. Whereas those workers who have been most adversely affected tend to be in lower paid sectors, and they contribute little to the income tax take in any event. So that's why the income tax take is holding up. And the other point of interest here is the corporation tax side. The 10 companies account for over 40% of that, but the multinational side doing very well here, feeding into the corporation tax take. This is a breakdown of exports last year. There's just one point I want to make, and this is going back to just the important anchor that foreign direct investment is providing for the Irish economy and the public finances. We excuse me, we exported almost 106 billion in chemical and pharma last year, up 13.8%. And that sector now accounts for almost 66% of our total merchandise exports. And then you can see the other sectors did less well. This is just, I made the point about the buildup of household and corporate finances, corporate savings in the last 12 months. Household deposits increased by 14.1 billion last year to reach 124.5 billion at the end of December. And indeed, at the end of January, those savings were over 126 billion. Those are record levels of savings. Household debt also has been falling significantly the last decade. So household finances in aggregate are improving sharply. And at some stage, you release the trigger of uncertainty, there will be a significant re-injection of spending power into the economy. In other words, pent-up demand. Likewise, on the non-financial corporate side, deposits up 11 billion last year, which is the highest level ever. A lot of investment has been put on hold. So the hope is that once that trigger is released again, that there will be a strong basis for a rebound in business investment. So just to wrap up before we go into question and answer, I am definitely a glass half full. I have a glass half full perspective on the economy at the moment. Well, maybe I shouldn't say at the moment because, with level 5 lockdown continuing, but once we come out of that, and once the virus is brought back under control and the vaccine program hopefully is rolled out, everything is set for a pretty rapid recovery. Pent-up demand, accumulated savings coming back into the system. I believe globally the policy levers will continue to be used appropriately. I think there's huge optimism about technological developments, and indeed some of the mRNA vaccines that have been developed are driven by technology, but also I think the manner in which technology has enabled the global economy to continue functioning despite the lockdown of large parts of economies. And I suppose what we're doing here this morning is an example of that. Personally, I never heard of Zoom this time last year. So you can see that technology has really, really reacted aggressively to this. And that definitely gives grounds for optimism. I also think the green agenda can be growth enhancing. Economists would have always argued that the green agenda would cost jobs, would cost economic activity. I actually think that's flipping now. I think there's a justifiable recognition that the green agenda actually can create jobs and economic activity. But whatever we think about the green agenda, the reality is irrelevant. The reality is the green agenda is here to stay, and it is going to dominate domestically and globally for decades to come. It has to. And I think the final point for optimism is that we are not going to see the sort of aggressive early approach to fiscal austerity that characterized 2008, 2009. So you could certainly suggest that austerity is dead and buried, at least for the moment. But there will be a challenge a couple of years down the road, and we saw Rishi Sunak addressing it yesterday. There will be a requirement to bring public finances back into under control again. But for the moment, there's a strong recognition that policymakers need to continue to provide solid support for economic activity for households, for businesses. Okay, Pat, you'll be glad to hear that's all I have to say. I'd be delighted to take any questions you have at this stage.
So Jim, Akara, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And we've got some questions in over that other ubiquitous technology platform, WhatsApp, as it happens, as opposed to the chat section down below, which is available to people. So Gramila Market, I think everyone will agree that was a really excellent masterclass. And on the glass half full, half empty analogy, hopefully in due course we'll get to raise a dram of Powers whiskey with you when we're out of lockdown, please God. So we've got a few questions coming in, and I guess one of the big ones, just to start off with a kind of a good ropey question, would be, what's your reaction, Jim, at the moment to the banking system and the implications for the Irish economy, and in terms of what's going on between BOI and Ulster Bank, for example? What's your sense of that?
To be honest, it depresses me, Pat. I firmly believe that competition, properly controlled and regulated, leads to better outcomes for consumers and for businesses. And what we've seen over the last decade has been a gradual consolidation of the banking system. A lot of international players have left the market. Ulster Bank, a couple of weeks ago, announced it's exiting the market. That's not good. You see Bank of Ireland going to shut 88 branches in the Republic of Ireland. So you see AIB being allowed to take over Goodbody stockbrokers. So unfortunately, the financial services sector is just becoming more and more consolidated. And unfortunately, that takes competition out of the system. And when competition is taken out of the system, the customers of financial institutions suffer as a result. So, we're effectively going to be left with a two and a little bit of a banking system. That is not good. And those two, the only strategy they appear to have is cost cutting through letting staff go, through closing branches. And customers will suffer. You could say I'm a dinosaur, that banking has gone online. And let's face it, we don't need branches anymore. I kind of tend to disagree. I think banking is very important. It's an important part of business economic activity. It is very much a relationship. Well, I think it should be a relationship-driven process. And I'm utterly despondent about it, I have to say. And I am arguing at the moment that we really need to look at the creation of a significant third force. The Sparkassen in Germany is an example of a public banking system that works for small business. Okay, I just believe the government really needs to look at the role that the post offices, the credit unions, and the 75% stake we have in permanent TSB can actually play in the creation of a third force. But I even noticed in the last couple of days, Pascal Donoghue has ruled out any possibility of that happening. So I don't like it, and I don't see international competition coming in here anytime soon. So I think it's small businesses that will be the biggest casualty of this, and I think a lot of people will become excluded from banking. And I also, obviously, there is the regional economic bit, because when you see banks shutting down, you see more vibrancy being taken off the streets of our towns and villages around the country.
Okay. And in the vein of kind of your own commentary about amazing, enormous, incredible, that 1.9 trillion support package in the States, which actually, when you think about it, is an incredible figure. A bit more locally, in the vein of kind of solid questions to you, what's your sense of, how would you interpret Irish politics currently in the space of where we're at?
I'll lay my colours on the line here, Pat. I believed last February, in the aftermath of the election, that the two parties who self-proclaim to be of the left and to be of the Republican tradition should have been forced to go into government together, as in Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin. Okay, because I think that would have brought Sinn Féin into the system. And it's really easy to be on the outside, to be criticizing everything, to be populist about everything. The one way you can put manners on anybody is to bring them into the tent. So that option was obviously not chosen. We got a coalition that I don't believe is functioning effectively. And I should say that my tendency would be to vote Fine Gael, because socially and economically, they're the closest alignment I can find to my belief system. Slightly right of centre economically, a bit left of centre socially. Okay, so I was distraught that they went into government, and I think that since last July, I think the government has been dreadful, to be honest. They are still playing civil war politics within the communication strategy is dreadful. So on a whole range of fronts, I don't like it. And there's going to be one winner, I would think, out of all of this, and that's Sinn Féin. And I don't like Sinn Féin's economic policies, but they're just going to get stronger and stronger out there.
Okay. Well, let's not put a tooth in it.
We're really ending on a down note here, aren't we?
No, on a positive side, and I do note that you're having a chat with Eamon Ryan next week, I think, who's the Minister for Climate Change. And to that end, there's that mega trend that you spoke to earlier in terms of the climate train, which has left the station, and everyone is pretty much, I think, accepting that that's a line of travel that we're all going to have to adopt and go forward on. And there's talk of carbon taxes being increased and so forth. And there's obviously, we're an all-island economy, even if we are split economically. So in terms of the Brexit space, I mean, do you see any opportunities for Ireland out of Brexit? To be clear about it.
Yeah, I mean, the opportunities, one I mentioned as in the potential for import substitution, okay, that there has to be an opportunity. And somebody said to me in the retail sector recently that we're having serious supply chain issues, that I'd love to see a few Irish producers coming in the door at the moment and offering me these products. You know, so we've got to get strategic about that. The second piece is the fact that Ireland is now the only native English-speaking country in the European Union, if you exclude Malta. So from a foreign direct investment perspective, you know, that has to be of benefit for US foreign direct investment. And I really think we should, you know, market that fact as aggressively as we can. I'm sure the IDA would be doing that anyway. And if you think about it, Waterford is the 5th largest native English speaking city. You know, some people argue we don't speak English down there, but it's the 5th largest native English speaking city in the European Union. Cork is the 2nd largest. So I'm being a bit flippant here, but you know, it does. I think that's an important consideration.
No, there are guys in Newfoundland that would agree with you in terms of the English-speaking element of the equation, Jim, in fairness.
You can meet plenty of powers in Newfoundland.
That's it. And, you know, indeed, just another one, kind of, when we look at kind of the landscape out there, and a question that came in from John Anthony Fitzsimons, you know, just the whole area of Bitcoin. What's your take on that? Cryptocurrencies.
Oh, God. I said, John, that I was a dinosaur in relation to my view on banking. I'm even more of a dinosaur in relation to my view on Bitcoin. I actually, I read a lot about it. I've tried to understand it. I actually don't understand how something that is effectively a medium of exchange can have such inherent value. I just don't get it. And personally, would I invest in Bitcoin? No, I wouldn't. Not because I don't believe Bitcoin is going to appreciate in value, or may not, but the reason why I wouldn't invest in it is because I don't understand it, and I would never invest in something that I don't understand. To me, it smacks of the dot-com bubble, when we had all of these dot-com companies who never made a profit and never would make a profit achieve huge valuations. So you're talking to a deep skeptic here, but it's interesting. A friend of mine, Chris Johns, who does an article in the Irish Times every Monday morning, and in fact, I should get the commercial in here. Chris and myself have just launched in the last 2 weeks a podcast called The Other Hand, where we discuss some of these issues. But exactly. But Chris did a podcast with Eamon Dunphy on the Stand a few weeks ago about Bitcoin. And he'd be of a very similar view to myself, very skeptical about it all, thinks there's really dark stuff underlying it all. And he said that of all the things he's ever done, he never got so much hate mail. There is a huge sort of a cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, almost a priestly cult out there at the moment. It worries me on many different levels, I have to say.
Yeah, it's a little bit opaque, I have to say, and we've covered before in a previous class going back last year, funnily enough, and it is a little bit opaque, the whole kind of groundings of it. So Jim, look, Akara, Gramila Mahagat, I'm conscious that we said we get people out and clear within the hour, and thank you so much for your time. There's a lot of other questions coming in. We'll populate them, and we'll maybe touch base and maybe have you back again later in the year when we've navigated out of these stormy waters. It's been a really powerful session. You've shared a lot of deep learnings with us, and thank you for that. You've been very open and frank with us. And look, we look forward to meeting you in physically. And I'll leave you with a term that I came to learn earlier in the week: the phygital world, where the physical and the digital world coincide. So there's a word for the day. And best of luck, Jim. Garamila Magatakara.
Thank you very much, folks. Very best of luck.
Sending out the details afterwards.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you.